The morning sun cast long shadows across the waters of Tawitawi anchorage on June 13, 1944, as the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy prepared for what would become one of the most decisive naval engagements of the Pacific War. Among the warships assembled in this remote corner of the southwestern Philippines, the aircraft carrier Shokaku stood as a testament to Japanese naval engineering and ambition. Her flight deck, stretching nearly 850 ft, had launched the aircraft that attacked Pearl Harbor 30 months earlier. Now she was about to embark on her final voyage, though neither her crew of 1663 men nor their commanding officers could have foreseen the submarine that would seal her fate. Just 6 days later, Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa watched from the bridge of his flagship as the combined elements of the first mobile fleet began their departure sequence. The formation was impressive by any standard. 3 fleet carriers, including Shukaku and her sister ships Zuikaku and Taiho, accompanied by an array of supporting vessels. The heavy cruisers, Atargo, Takao, Maya, and Chokai, took their screening positions while 13 destroyers formed a protective ring around the capital ships. This represented the last great concentration of Japanese carrier power in the Pacific, a force that had once dominated the ocean from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. The fleet's departure from Tawitawi was not merely another sortie. It represented Japan's desperate gamble to reverse the tide of war that had turned decisively against them since Midway. As the anchor chains rattled up through the horse holes and the great vessels began to move, thousands of sailors stood at their posts, unaware that within a week over 1,200 of them would perish in the warm waters of the Philippine Sea. The destination was the Marana Islands, where American forces had begun their assault on Saipan. The mission was nothing less than the destruction of the U.S. Pacific Fleet carrier force. The strategic situation facing Japan in mid-1944 was catastrophic. The empire that had expanded so rapidly in 1941 and early 1942 was now contracting under relentless American pressure. The loss of the Gilbert Islands, the neutralization of True, and now the American invasion of the Marianas represented more than territorial losses. They signaled the approaching endgame of the Pacific War. Saipan, in particular, held special significance. Its capture would place American B-29 superfortress bombers within range of Tokyo itself, bringing the war directly to the Japanese homeland for the first time since the Dittle Raid. Admiral Su Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, understood the gravity of the situation perfectly. The loss of the Maranas would sever Japan's communications with its ressortoric southern territories and expose the home islands to devastating strategic bombing. In response, he authorized Operation Eigo, a complex plan that sought to leverage Japan's remaining advantages: the longer range of its carrier aircraft, land-based aviation support from island airfields, and the superior training of its battleship gunners in night combat. The plan called for the mobile fleet to engage the American carriers in a decisive battle, while they were committed to supporting the amphibious operations at Saipan. Yet, the Japanese Navy of 1944 bore little resemblance to the force that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor. The attrition of experienced pilots was perhaps the most critical weakness. The veterans who had executed the precision attacks at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Colombo were mostly dead, victims of the grinding battles at Midway, the Solomons, and the Santa Cruz Islands. Their replacements, rushed through abbreviated training programs, possessed neither the skill nor the experience of their predecessors. Many of the pilots aboard Shokaku and her sister carriers had fewer than 200 flying hours compared to the 800-plus hours of their American counterparts. The fuel situation presented another critical vulnerability. Japan's merchant marine, systematically hunted by American submarines, could no longer reliably transport refined fuel from the East Indies to the home islands. The mobile fleet was forced to operate on unrefined Tarakan crude oil pumped directly from Borneo's wells into the ship's bunkers. This heavy sulfurous petroleum produced thick black smoke, clogged boilers, and reduced the fleet's maximum speed. Engine room crews worked in hellish conditions as the crude oil released toxic fumes that made extended operations below decks nearly unbearable. Despite these handicaps, Ozawa's fleet remained formidable on paper. The Japanese had assembled 9 aircraft carriers carrying approximately 440 aircraft, supported by 5 battleships, including the mighty Yamato and Musashi, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. This force would face Admiral Raymond Spruant's Fifth Fleet, which boasted 15 carriers with 956 aircraft, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. The Americans held decisive advantages in numbers, pilot quality, radar technology, and logistics. But Ozawa hoped that careful tactics and the element of surprise might offset these disadvantages. The strategic chess match between Ozawa and Spruant began even before the fleets departed their respective anchorages. Japanese naval intelligence had correctly identified the Maranas as the next American target, allowing Ozawa to preposition his forces for a counterstrike. The admiral's plan was elegant in its conception. He would keep his carriers beyond the range of American aircraft while using his own longer-ranged planes to strike the U.S. fleet. Japanese carrier aircraft, stripped of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to save weight, could attack from 300 miles away. While American planes had an effective combat radius of only 200 miles, Ozawa also counted on support from over 500 land-based aircraft stationed at airfields on Guam, Roe, Tinian, and Yap. These planes would execute preliminary attacks on the American fleet, weakening it before the carrier engagement. The combined assault of land and carrier-based aviation would, in theory, overwhelm the American defenses and create opportunities for decisive strikes. The Japanese admiral positioned his fleet in 3 groups: Van Force under Vice Admiral Tako Karita with the light carriers, Force A with Ozawa himself aboard Taihaho, along with Shukaku and Zuikaku, and Force B under Rear Admiral Takagi Jashima with the remaining carriers. Admiral Spruant, commanding the American forces, faced a complex tactical problem. His primary mission was to protect the amphibious forces at Saipan, but he also needed to engage and destroy the Japanese fleet if the opportunity arose. Intelligence reports from coast watchers and signals intercepts indicated that a major Japanese naval force was approaching, but its exact composition and intentions remained unclear. Spruant positioned his Task Force 58, divided into 4 carrier groups to the west of the Maranas, creating a barrier between the Japanese and the invasion beaches. The submarine force under Admiral Charles Lockwood played a crucial but often overlooked role in this strategic positioning. Lockwood had studied Japanese naval patterns and correctly anticipated that any relief force would pass through the Philippine Sea. He positioned his submarines in a scouting line, creating what he called the NA line, a series of patrol zones that would serve as an early warning system. 4 submarines, Albaor, Bang, Finback, and Stingray, were positioned at precise coordinates, forming a net through which the Japanese fleet would likely pass. What Lockwood didn't anticipate was that another submarine, not originally part of his carefully planned deployment, would achieve one of the most significant victories of the submarine war. USS Cavalla, on her maiden war patrol, was about to intersect with Destiny, her commanding officer. Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kozler had received orders to patrol east of the Philippines, but changing circumstances would soon place his boat directly in the path of Ozawa's advancing fleet. The USS Cavalla SS-244 represented the pinnacle of American submarine design in 1944. Built at the Electric Boat Company's shipyard in Groton, Connecticut. She was a Gateau-class fleet submarine, one of 77 boats of her class that would serve as the backbone of the U.S. submarine force throughout the war. Laid down on March 4, 1943, and launched on November 14 of the same year, Cavalla was commissioned on February 29, 1944, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kosler, a 36-year-old career naval officer from Ohio, who had graduated from the Naval Academy in Ayat-Mup at 311 9 in length and displacing 1,526 tons on the surface. Cavalla was a formidable weapon of war. Her pressure hull, constructed of high tensile steel, could withstand depths of up to 400 dVA, though her test depth was listed at 300 dVA, powered by 4 Fairbanks Morse diesel engines, generating 5,400 horsepower on the surface, and 4 General Electric motors producing 2,740 horsepower when submerged. She could achieve speeds of 20.25 knots surfaced and 8.75 knots submerged. Her range was equally impressive, 11,000 nautical miles on the surface at 10 knots, though this was reduced to 48 hours at 2 knots when operating on battery power underwater. The submarine's primary armament consisted of 10 21-in torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, with storage for 241 or Mark 18 torpedoes. Each Mark C-14 torpedo was 20 FTU-6 in long, weighed 280 lives or beaters, and carried a 603 mm Torpex warhead, capable of breaking the back of all but the most heavily armored warships. The troubled history of the Mark 14 with its defective magnetic exploder and tendency to run deeper than set had largely been resolved by 1944, making Cavalla's torpedoes far more reliable than those used earlier in the war. Secondary armament included a 5-in-25 caliber deck gun with 200 rounds and 250 caliber machine guns for anti-aircraft defense. Cavalla's crew of 72 officers and enlisted men had spent 3 months in intensive training before departing on their first war patrol. The submarine community was unique within the Navy. Officers and enlisted men lived and worked in extraordinarily close quarters, creating a level of interdependence unknown in the surface fleet. Every man from Kosler down to the most junior seaman had to qualify on every system aboard the boat. Lives depended on each crew member being able to perform any critical function in an emergency, whether operating the diving planes, managing the trim tanks, or firing torpedoes. The boat's technology represented the cutting edge of submarine warfare. Her SJ surface search radar could detect enemy vessels at ranges up to 12 miles in good conditions, while the ST air search radar provided warning of approaching aircraft. The ST periscope radar, though temperamental, allowed for precise range finding during attack approaches. Below the waterline, JK sound gear enabled the submarine to track targets acoustically. Though the system was primitive compared to what would emerge later in the war, the Torpedo Data Computer, TDC, an electromechanical analog computer, calculated firing solutions by integrating target bearing, range, speed, and course with the submarine's own movement. Cavalla's journey to her appointment with history began on June 4, 1944, when she departed Midway Island for her maiden war patrol. The boat had arrived at Pearl Harbor in mid-May after a 5,000-mile journey from Connecticut via the Panama Canal, then proceeded to Midway for final preparations. During the brief stay at Midway, Kostler and his officers received their final briefings, loaded fresh provisions and ammunition, and made last-minute repairs and adjustments. The crew took what they knew might be their last liberty in civilization, though Midway offered far fewer amenities than Pearl Harbor. The submarine's assigned patrol area encompassed the waters east of the Philippines, specifically the approaches to San Bernardino Strait and Surya Strait, the 2 primary passages through the Philippine archipelago. These strategic waterways served as highways for Japanese naval and merchant traffic, moving between the home islands and the resource-rich territories of the Netherlands East Indies. Kosler's orders were to interdict enemy shipping, gather intelligence on Japanese naval movements, and serve as a scout for the larger American operations unfolding to the east. The first days of the patrol proved uneventful as Cavalla moved westward across the vast expanse of the Pacific. The crew settled into the monotonous routine of submarine operations, 4 hours on watch, 8 hours off, with the off-duty time split between sleeping, eating, and maintaining the boat's complex machinery. The submarine ran on the surface at night, her diesels charging the massive battery banks while making good speed toward the patrol area. During daylight hours, she often submerged to avoid detection by enemy aircraft, creeping along at 3 knots to conserve battery power. On June 8th, while transiting the waters near Marcus Island, approximately 200 miles southeast of Tokyo, Cavalla experienced her first unusual incident of the patrol. The officer of the deck reported a sudden jolt and vibration from the stern, followed by what appeared to be a pool of blood in the boat's wake. Kostler ordered all stop and sent men to inspect the propellers and stern planes. Finding no damage, he concluded that they had struck a small whale, one of many that inhabited these waters. The incident, while minor, served as a reminder of the ocean's many hazards beyond enemy action. The weather began deteriorating on June 14th as Cavalla approached her assigned patrol area. Barometric pressure dropped steadily, and seas built to 15 navinarv, sending solid water over the bridge and down the conning tower hatch. The boat pitched and rolled violently, making normal operations nearly impossible. Men were thrown from their bunks, dishes crashed in the galley, and several crew members suffered severe seasickness. Kostler attempted to transmit a weather report to Pearl Harbor, valuable information for the fleet meteorologists planning air operations, but the storm's intensity prevented successful transmission. After fighting the typhoon for 18 hours, he ordered the boat submerged to ride out the storm in the relative calm below the surface. As the storm passed on June 15th, Cavalla surfaced to find clearing skies and moderating seas almost immediately. The radio operator intercepted a contact report from USS Flying Fish, another submarine operating nearby. Flying Fish had spotted a Japanese task force moving east at high speed, but had been unable to gain an attack position. The sighting electrified Cavalla's crew. Major Japanese fleet units had been scarce since the battles of 1942, and the opportunity to engage capital ships was exactly what every submarine commander dreamed of. Kostler immediately ordered a course change to intercept the reported contact and increased speed to 17 knots, pushing the diesels hard despite the still rough seas. He made contact with USS Pipefish, also responding to Flying Fish's report, and the 2 submarines agreed to conduct a coordinated search. They would separate by 20 meters and sweep along the enemy's projected track, doubling their chances of making contact. Throughout the night of June 15th to 16th, lookouts strained their eyes searching for the distinctive silhouettes of Japanese warships, while the radar operator continuously swept the SJ scope for electronic contacts. Dawn on June 16th brought disappointment. Despite covering over 200 miles during the night search, neither submarine had found the Japanese task force. Kostler reluctantly concluded that the enemy had either changed course or increased speed beyond his calculations. He ordered Cavalla back to her assigned patrol area, but the brief taste of potential action had energized the crew. Every man aboard now knew that major Japanese fleet units were operating in their vicinity, and the chance for a significant engagement had increased dramatically. Just before midnight on June 16th, the SJ radar detected multiple contacts to the southwest. The operator reported what appeared to be 5 or 6 vessels moving at moderate speed. Kostler rushed to the conning tower and studied the radar display. The formation looked like a convoy. 2 large contacts that could be tankers or cargo ships escorted by 3 or 4 smaller vessels, probably destroyers or escort vessels. This was exactly the type of target submarines were expected to engage, and Kostler ordered battle stations as Cavalla began her approach. The attack approach proved frustrating. The Japanese escorts were alert and aggressive, constantly pinging with active sonar and making random course changes. Every time Cavalla maneuvered into a favorable position, a destroyer would suddenly turn toward them, forcing Kostler to go deep and evade. After 3 hours of cat and mouse maneuvering, during which the submarine never got closer than 4,000 yards to the main targets, a destroyer charged directly at Cavalla's position. Kostler ordered an emergency dive to 300 aft, rigged for silent running, and waited as the escort passed overhead, the sound of its screws clearly audible through the hull. When Cavalla finally surfaced at 0200 on June 17th, the convoy had vanished into the darkness. Kostler was frustrated, but philosophical. Such was the nature of submarine warfare. What he didn't know was that the convoy he had been pursuing consisted of fleet oilers supporting Ozawa's mobile fleet. Had he successfully attacked these vessels, the Japanese carriers would have been forced to curtail their operations due to fuel shortage. Sometimes in war, the attacks that fail have as much historical significance as those that succeed. The afternoon of June 17th brought new orders from COM Subpac. Based on multiple submarine sightings and signal intelligence, Admiral Lockwood was repositioning his boats to intercept what was clearly a major Japanese fleet movement. Cavalla was ordered to take position at 1300 north, 13700 east, approximately 350 miles west of Guam. Kostler plotted the new position and ordered a course change, pushing the boat hard to reach the assigned coordinates before the expected Japanese arrival. At 1945 hours on June 17th, as Cavalla raced toward her new position, the SJ radar operator reported a faint contact bearing 290 degrees range, 30,000 swires. The contact was intermittent, appearing and disappearing with each radar sweep, suggesting it was at the extreme range of the equipment. Claire ordered a course change to close the contact and increased speed to maximum. As the range decreased, more contacts appeared on the radar screen. First 2, then 4, then 7 distinct returns. By 2015 hours, Costa had identified what could only be a major Japanese task force. The radar returns indicated at least 7 large vessels moving at 19 knots on a base course of 45 degrees. The formation was zigzagging, a standard anti-submarine tactic, but the base course suggested they were heading toward the Marianas. Through careful plotting, Kostler identified what appeared to be at least one aircraft carrier, several possible battleships or heavy cruisers, and screening destroyers. This was no merchant convoy. Cavalla had stumbled upon a major element of the Japanese fleet. The decision Kostler faced was one of the most difficult in submarine warfare. His boat was in perfect position to attack with the Japanese force approaching his position. A spread of torpedoes fired at the right moment could damage or sink a capital ship. But Kostler also understood the strategic importance of his discovery. Admiral Spruant's fleet needed to know the location, composition, and course of this Japanese force. The information was potentially more valuable than any damage Cavalla alone could inflict. After a brief consultation with his executive officer, Kostler made the harder choice. He would forego the attack and surface to transmit a contact report. Surfacing a submarine in proximity to enemy warships violated every instinct of submarine warfare. But Costa knew the stakes. At 21:45, after the Japanese force had passed beyond visual range, Cavalla surfaced into the tropical darkness. The radio operator immediately began transmitting the contact report on the submarine force frequency. Large enemy task force, latitude 13 degrees north, longitude 136 degrees 30 minutes east base. Course 045 speed, 19 knots composition, at least one carrier, several battleships or cruisers, multiple destroyers. The message was received at Pearl Harbor and immediately relayed to Admiral Spruant aboard USS Indianapolis. This was the first definitive report of the approaching Japanese carrier force, confirming what American intelligence had suspected. Spruant now knew that a major fleet engagement was imminent and could position his forces accordingly. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, though Kozler didn't know it at the time, had effectively begun with Cavalla's contact report. After transmitting the message and receiving acknowledgement, Cavalla submerged and attempted to regain contact with the Japanese force. Despite running at maximum submerged speed, the submarine could not overtake the faster surface ships. By dawn on June 18th, Kozler reluctantly abandoned the pursuit and returned to his assigned patrol position. The crew was disappointed at missing an attack opportunity, but Kozler assured them that their contact report had been invaluable to the fleet. Little did they know that their most significant contribution was yet to come. Throughout June 18th, Cavalla remained submerged during daylight hours, surfacing only briefly after dark to receive radio traffic and recharge batteries. The airwaves were alive with encrypted messages as American and Japanese forces maneuvered for position. Kostler could sense that something major was developing, but had no clear picture of the larger battle. His orders were to maintain position and attack any enemy vessels that entered his patrol area. The crew spent the day conducting routine maintenance, checking torpedoes, and preparing for action they sensed was imminent. At 03:45 on June 19th, the quiet routine was shattered when a low-flying aircraft passed directly over the submarine. The officer of the deck barely had time to sound the diving alarm before the plane roared overhead, its engine noise drowning out all other sounds. Cavalla Crash dived, her bow pointing sharply downward as the ballast tanks flooded. The crew waited tensely for the explosion of aerial bombs, but none came. Either the aircraft hadn't spotted them in the darkness, or it had no weapons to drop. After 30 minutes submerged, Kozler brought the boat back to periscope depth. As dawn broke on June 19th, 1944, Cavalla found herself in an extraordinarily fortuitous position. Unknown to Kozler, the complex movements of the Japanese and American fleets had placed his submarine directly in the path of Ozawa's main carrier force. The Japanese admiral, believing his position still undetected, had launched his first strike wave against the American carriers at 08:30. Now, as these aircraft departed, the Japanese carriers turned into the wind to recover their combat air patrol and prepare for subsequent launches. At 10:48, Cavalla's sound operator reported high-speed screws bearing 070. Kozler raised the periscope for a brief observation and immediately ordered it lowered. On the horizon, he had spotted the pagoda-style masts characteristic of Japanese warships. He ordered battle stations submerged, and the crew rushed to their combat positions with practiced efficiency. The torpedo room crews checked their weapons one final time. The diving officer fine-tuned the boat's trim, and the plotting party prepared to develop a firing solution. At 10:52, Costa made his second periscope observation. This time, the view took his breath away. A large aircraft carrier accompanied by at least one heavy cruiser and several destroyers was approaching from the northeast at approximately 20 knots. The carrier was recovering aircraft with planes circling overhead, waiting their turn to land. The flight deck was crowded with aircraft that had already recovered, their wings still extended. Kostler estimated the range at 12,000 miles, too far for an effective torpedo attack, but the carrier's course would bring it much closer. The next 15 minutes required exceptional submarine handling. Kozler needed to maneuver Cavalla into an optimal firing position without being detected by the screening destroyers. He could only afford brief periscope observations, as the escorts were actively searching for submarines. The TDC operator continuously updated the firing solution based on Costa's observations and the sound bearings provided by the sonar operator. The carrier was identified as a Shokaku-class vessel based on its distinctive profile: the small island structure offset to starboard, the massive flight deck, and the unique arrangement of anti-aircraft guns. At 11:10, Kozler made what he intended to be his final observation before firing. The carrier, now positively identified as either Shokaku or Zukaku based on the pagoda mast and flight deck configuration, was at a range of 5,000 Dwazuled and closing. The angle on the bow was nearly perfect for a broadside shot. However, the destroyer Urakazi was moving into a position that would block the torpedo run. Kozler had to make a split-second decision: wait for the destroyer to clear and risk losing the shot, or fire immediately and hope the destroyer didn't interfere with the torpedo tracks. At 11:18 with Shokaku at a range of US-200 Wysiers, Kozler made his decision. "Fire 1, he commanded, and the first torpedo left Cavalla's number 1 tube with the characteristic shutter and high-pressure air discharge. At 8-second intervals, 5 more torpedoes followed, spreading in a fan pattern calculated to ensure at least some hits, regardless of any last-minute course changes by the target. The torpedo run was set for 15 ft, shallow enough to strike above the carrier's armor belt, but deep enough to avoid surface turbulence. Even as the 6th torpedo was leaving its tube, Costa ordered, "Take her deep, flood negative, full dive on the bow planes." Cavalla's bow angled sharply downward as tons of water flooded into the negative tank. The submarine was passing 100 ft when the first explosion resonated through the water. A deep, satisfying boom that brought smiles to the crew's faces despite their precarious situation. 8 seconds later, a second explosion, then a third. Kozler had hoped for 4 hits, but 3 was an excellent result against a maneuvering target aboard Shukaku. The first indication of danger came when a lookout spotted torpedo wakes approaching from starboard. The officer of the watch immediately ordered full right rudder and emergency speed, but it was too late. The first torpedo struck amidship at frame 145, tearing a massive hole in the hull and flooding the number 3 boiler room. The second hit further forward, destroying aviation fuel bunkers and starting fires among the aircraft parked on the hangar deck. The third torpedo struck near the forward elevator, causing it to jam in the raised position and rendering flight operations impossible. The carrier immediately took on a severe list to starboard, as thousands of tons of water poured through the gaping holes in her hull. Damage control parties struggled to contain the flooding, but the situation was complicated by the aviation gasoline fires spreading through the hangar spaces. The ship's commanding officer, Captain Matsubara Hiroshi, ordered counter-flooding to correct the list, but this only reduced the carrier's reserve buoyancy. Within minutes of the torpedo strikes, Shokaku had slowed to 12 knots and was clearly in mortal danger. Back aboard Cavalla, the celebration was short-lived. 2 minutes after firing, the first depth charges detonated above and behind the submarine. The Japanese escorts had either detected the submarine's periscope or traced back the torpedo wakes to their point of origin. Now began a deadly game of cat and mouse as Cavalla went deep and silent, trying to evade the destroyers hunting her. The submarine passed 300 d'altitude, approaching her test depth, as more depth charges exploded in patterns around her estimated position. The depth charge attack was methodical and relentless. The Japanese destroyers worked in coordination, one maintaining sonar contact, while the other made attack runs. The charges were set to detonate at varying depths, creating a 3-dimensional kill zone that Cavalla had to somehow evade. At 11:35, a pattern of 6 charges detonated so close that cork insulation rained from the overhead. Light bulbs shattered, and the submarine's hull groaned under the pressure waves. Kostler ordered silent running, shutting down all non-essential equipment to reduce noise signature. The crew removed their shoes, moving about in stocking feet to minimize sound. The air conditioning was secured, and within minutes the temperature inside the submarine began rising toward unbearable levels. Men stood at their stations, sweating profusely, breathing shallowly to conserve the increasingly stale air. In the maneuvering room, electricians watched the battery gauges slowly decline, calculating how long they could maintain submerged operations. At 11:44, the sound operator reported a destroyer passing directly overhead. The crew could hear the rhythmic thrashing of the escort screws growing louder, reaching a crescendo as the vessel passed over them, then gradually fading. Everyone braced for the depth charges that would surely follow, but surprisingly, none came. Either the destroyer had lost contact or was repositioning for a better attack angle. Koestler used this respite to order a course change, hoping to slip away from the search area while the destroyers regrouped. For the next 2 hours, Cavalla played a desperate game of evasion. Koestler varied the submarine's depth between 250 and 405 feet, changed course frequently, but gradually, and used the temperature gradients in the water to hide from Japanese sonar. The depth charging continued sporadically, with patterns detonating at various distances. By 1300, the sound operator reported that only one destroyer remained in close proximity. The others had apparently returned to escort the damaged carrier. At 1332, a series of peculiar noises began emanating from the direction of the torpedo attack. The sound operator described them as breaking up noises, the characteristic sound of a ship's hull collapsing under pressure. These continued intermittently for the next half hour, suggesting that Shukaku was suffering progressive structural failure. At 14:08, 4 tremendous explosions shook Cavalla despite the distance. These were not depth charges, but something far more powerful, likely the detonation of Shukaku's ammunition magazines or aviation fuel bunkers. As Cavalla continued her evasion, the drama aboard Shukaku reached its climax. The carrier's damage control efforts had initially shown promise, with the crew managing to contain the initial flooding and extinguish some fires. However, the structural damage was too severe. The torpedo hits had not only opened the hull to the sea, but had also damaged critical fuel lines and ventilation systems. Aviation gasoline vapors heavier than air accumulated in the lower compartments, despite efforts to ventilate them. At approximately 1400, these vapors reached an ignition source, possibly a spark from damaged electrical equipment or hot metal from the earlier fires. The resulting explosion tore through Shukaku's interior, destroying what remained of her watertight integrity. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the armored flight deck several feet, sending aircraft and crew members flying. Secondary explosions followed as ready ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns cooked off in the intense heat. Captain Matsubara ordered abandoned ship at 1410, but many of the crew were already trapped below decks by fire, flooding, or structural collapse. The carrier's list increased rapidly to 45 days, making movement on deck nearly impossible. Men slid down the caning flight deck into the water, where they struggled to swim clear of the sinking ship's suction. The destroyer Urakaze and light cruiser Yahagi moved in to rescue survivors, their crews throwing lines and life rings to men in the water. At 15:01, Shukaku capsized to starboard and sank stern first. As she went down, more explosions erupted from within her hull, possibly from boilers contacting cold sea air or remaining ammunition detonating. The carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor participated in the Coral Sea battle and survived numerous engagements throughout the war. Finally met her end in the depths of the Philippine Sea. Of her crew of 1,663 officers and men, 1,272 perished, including Captain Matsubara, who chose to go down with his ship. Approximately 570 survivors were rescued by the Japanese escorts. The strategic impact of Shukaku's loss extended far beyond the elimination of a single carrier, coming simultaneously with the loss of Taiho to USS Albaor's torpedoes. The Japanese carrier force had lost 2 of its 3 fleet carriers in a single day. More critically, hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable aircrew were lost. The Japanese naval aviation, already weakened by attrition, would never recover from the losses suffered on June 19, 1944. A day that would become known to American aviators as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By 1500, Cavalla's battery was approaching exhaustion, and the air inside the submarine was barely breathable. Carbon dioxide levels had risen to dangerous levels, causing headaches and lethargy among the crew. Kostler made the decision to come to periscope depth, despite the possibility of enemy destroyers still searching for them. To his relief, the periscope revealed empty ocean in all directions. The Japanese escorts had departed either to rescue Shukaku survivors or to rejoin what remained of their carrier force. At 1900, after more than 7 hours, submerged, Cavalla surfaced into the tropical twilight. The crew immediately started the diesel engines, bringing blessed fresh air into the fated submarine. Men stumbled topside, gulping the clean ocean air and cooling themselves in the spray breaking over the bow. The batteries began their long recharge cycle, and the air conditioning was restored, gradually bringing the interior temperature down from its peak of 125 degrees. Kostler's first priority was to report the attack to Pearl Harbor. The radio operator transmitted attacked Shoku-class carrier 3 hits, observed heavy explosions heard after going deep. Believed target, sank position 1150, north 13757 east. The message was received with jubilation at submarine headquarters. Admiral Lockwood himself drafted the reply. Well done, Cavalla. Her achievement beyond expectations. The submarine continued her patrol for another 6 weeks, though no action would match the intensity of June 19th. On July 1st, Cavalla arrived at the newly captured port of Saipan for fuel and provisions. The scene that greeted them was surreal. Hundreds of ships anchored in the harbor, the island still smoking from the ongoing battle, and the constant thunder of naval gunfire supporting marine operations. Ashore, staff officers from Admiral Spruant and Turner came aboard to debrief Kostler and congratulate the crew personally. The full magnitude of Cavalla's achievement became clear when combined with the broader results of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese had lost 3 aircraft carriers, over 600 aircraft, and suffered irreplaceable losses in trained aircrew. The mobile fleet, Japan's last hope for offensive naval operations, had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. While the war would continue for another 14 months, Japan's fate had been sealed in the waters of the Philippine Sea. The sinking of Shukaku represented more than the loss of a single warship. It symbolized the complete reversal of fortune in the Pacific War. The carrier that had launched the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, participating in Japan's stunning early victories, had been destroyed by a submarine from the nation she had helped awaken to war. The irony was not lost on naval historians or the American public when the story was released after the war's end. Cavalla's success on her first war patrol established her as one of the most celebrated submarines in the Pacific Fleet. She would complete 5 more war patrols, sinking 3 additional Japanese vessels. The exact tonnage of her subsequent victories varies in different records, but her most significant achievement remained that single spread of torpedoes fired on June 19, 1944. Lieutenant Commander Kostler was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions, and Cavalla received the Presidential Unit Citation for her first patrol. The submarine's achievement must be understood within the broader context of the submarine war against Japan. American submarines, comprising less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel, accounted for 55% of all Japanese maritime losses during the war. They sank 2011 warships totaling 540,000 tons and 113 merchant vessels totaling 4.9 million tons. This GA course effectively strangled Japan's island empire, cutting off vital resources and isolating outlying garrisons. The sinking of capital ships like Shukaku grabbed headlines, but the steady attrition of Japan's merchant marine ultimately proved decisive. The tactical lessons from Cavalla's attack influenced submarine doctrine for the remainder of the war. Kostler's decision to report the enemy task force before attacking demonstrated the strategic value of submarines as scouts for the fleet. His patience in achieving an optimal firing position, Making only 3 periscope observations during the approach phase became a textbook example of fire control technique. The successful evasion of the subsequent depth charge attack validated American submarine construction techniques and damage control training. Post-war analysis revealed interesting discrepancies between American and Japanese accounts of the attack. While Kosler reported 3 torpedo hits, some Japanese survivors insisted 4 torpedoes struck home. Japanese records indicate that 105 depth charges were dropped during the attack, with 56 detonating close to Cavalla. The exact cause of the final explosions that doomed Shukaku remains debated. Whether it was aviation fuel vapors, ammunition magazines, or a combination of factors. What remains undisputed is that Cavalla's attack combined with Albacore's torpedoing of Taihaho eliminated 2/3 of Ozawa's carrier strength in a single day. The human cost of Shukaku's sinking deserves remembrance. The 1272 Japanese sailors who perished were not fanatics or war criminals, but professional seamen doing their duty as they understood it. Many were conscripts barely out of their teens, others veteran sailors who had served aboard Shukaku since her commissioning. Their deaths, while necessary in the context of total war, represent individual tragedies multiplied 1/200-fold. Among the dead were many veteran officers who had served with distinction throughout the war. The location of Shukaku's wreck remains unknown to this day. Unlike many other major warships from the Pacific War that have been discovered by deep-sea exploration teams, Shukaku's final resting place in the Philippine Sea has yet to be located. The carrier lies somewhere in the depths of the ocean, her hull likely broken by the massive internal explosions that sealed her fate. For the families of the 272 men who went down with her, the lack of a known gravesite remains a source of continuing grief. Cavalla herself survived the war and continued to serve the United States Navy in various capacities until 1969. She was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1982 and is now preserved as a museum ship at Seawolf Park in Galveston, Texas. Visitors can walk through her narrow compartments, peer through the periscope that Costa used to target Shoku, and stand in the control room where life and death decisions were made in split seconds. The submarine stands as a tangible reminder of the courage and skill of the silent service. The strategic implications of the Battle of the Philippine Sea and Cavalla's role in it extended beyond the immediate military victory. The destruction of Japanese carrier aviation opened the way for the liberation of the Philippines, the invasion of Iwo and Okinawa, and ultimately the planned invasion of Japan itself. While that invasion proved unnecessary, due to Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings, the naval supremacy established in June 1944 made those subsequent operations possible. In the grand narrative of World War II, the sinking of Shukaku by Cavalla represents a perfect microcosm of the Pacific War's evolution. The Japanese Navy, that had seemed invincible in 1941–42, had been systematically destroyed by American industrial might, technological superiority, and the courage of individual sailors and submariners. The hunter had become the hunted, and the empire that had gambled on a quick victory found itself facing inevitable defeat. Today, as tensions again rise in the Western Pacific, the lessons of the Philippine Sea remain relevant. The importance of submarine warfare, the value of intelligence and reconnaissance, the critical nature of trained personnel, and the decisive impact of technological advantage all echo through the decades. The story of Cavalla and Shukaku reminds us that naval supremacy once lost is difficult to regain, and that wars at sea can be decided in moments by the actions of relatively small units. The morning of June 19th, 1944 had begun with the Imperial Japanese Navy launching what it hoped would be a decisive counterstrike against the American invasion of the Marianas. By sunset, that hope had been shattered with 2 fleet carriers on the ocean floor and hundreds of aircraft destroyed. Among the many heroes of that day, the 72 men aboard USS Cavalla had played a pivotal role, demonstrating that in naval warfare, a single submarine with a determined crew could change the course of history. Their achievement stands as a testament to the submariner's motto, "We sink them regardless." As Hermann Clare would later reflect in his memoirs, the attack on Shukaku was both the culmination of years of training and preparation, and a matter of being in the right place at the right time. But as the great Admiral Chester Nimitz observed, luck is frequently the reward of those who are prepared to take advantage of opportunities. Cavalla was prepared. The opportunity presented itself, and the result was one of the most significant submarine attacks of the Second World War. The submarine that had left Groton just months earlier as another boat in the Gateau class had earned her place in naval history, writing her name in the annals of the silent service with torpedoes rather than ink.